Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas' telephone town hall meeting. This telephone town hall is like a traditional town hall meeting. It gives you a chance to hear from Congresswoman Tsongas about issues before Congress or anything that's on your mind, but from the convenience of your own home. In just a moment, Congresswoman Tsongas will give a few brief opening remarks. Then anyone on the call will have an opportunity to ask her your questions. If you would like to ask a question at any point during the call, just simply press *3 on your phone, and that option is open now, so if you do have a question, feel free to press *3 now, or again at any point during tonight's call. Since we do anticipate that many people on the call will have questions, after pressing *3, you will be connected with a member of the Congresswoman's staff, who will then take down some of your information so that we can connect you with Congresswoman in turn. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the course of the next hour, and to do so, we unfortunately won't have time for follow-up questions. So please try to ask your full question when you come on the line with the Congresswoman. One quick technical issue I want to point out before we get started is that there is sometimes a little bit of lag time in between questions, so please stay with us if there's a brief pause in the discussion as we move on to the next question. We will try to get to as many questions as we can over the course of the next hour. May not get to everyone's question, but if we are unable to get to your question this evening, you will still have the opportunity to leave it as a voicemail for the Congresswoman. And to do that, please stay on the line at the end of the call, and you will then be able to leave a message with your question, and we will get back to you with an answer as soon as possible. Again, if you would like to ask Congresswoman Tsongas a question, please press *3 on your phone now or at any point during the conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Good evening, and I want to thank everybody who's on the line for joining us. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect through these virtual town halls. It's one of the benefits of technology that lets me reach out to you and talk with you and hear from you from the comfort of your own homes. And for those of you who are on the line who are mothers, I want to wish you a belated Happy Mother's Day, it's certainly, or Grandmother's Day, as the case may be, and also hope everyone is finally beginning to enjoy the spring season. As I left Massachusetts today, we finally had a beautiful day, although arriving here in D.C., we were back in the rainy season. This is a busy time of year for Congress, and despite all the distractions of the presidential election, there is work we need to do, and we're looking ahead to some full sessions where we'll work to address some of the important issues that face our country. I know there are many issues on your minds on a whole range of topics, and I will try to answer as many questions as possible during the next hour. So again, to ask me a question or to give your input, just press *3 on your telephone. While I've been busy working on behalf of the 3rd District in Washington, D.C., I'm also very busy working back in the 3rd District right in Massachusetts. When Congress is not in session, as was the case last week, I always make a point to get out into the many communities, many diverse communities I represent, to talk with constituents and local business owners and see what's on their minds. So last week was Small Business Week, National Small Business Week. And with that, many of my visits had a focus on the meeting with outstanding entrepreneurs, small business owners, others in the local business communities to hear what the challenges were that they were facing. It gave me the chance to focus on, in particular, the work of several local small businesses, which I also make a priority to visit whether it's Small Business Week or not. Doing so gives me an opportunity to hear about those issues that impact small businesses in a unique way and how the federal government can be an active partner in helping small businesses succeed or where we may be getting in the way. There is a program that I became familiar with when first arriving in Washington at the end of 2007, something called the Small Business Innovation Research Program that sets aside federal funding for startups who have a good idea but whose ideas are not yet eligible for other kinds of funding. It's been an invaluable resource for these small startup companies, and I've been a strong supporter of it and will continue to be to make sure we keep that program alive. But to give you an example of some of the things I did last week, I visited a couple of educational institutions just to highlight how education plays a critical role in preparing our young people for jobs in the manufacturing sector. We had an emphasis there. So I went to the Greater Lawrence Technical High School last Monday, and this is a school that provides the Merrimack Valley with incredible training and education for young people who are seeking to make their way immediately out into the workforce upon graduation from high school. Many do go on to college as well, or many go into the workforce and then make their way to college. But I had a chance to see the remarkable training that takes place in that particular technical high school, but I know it's true of many of our vocational technical high schools. There exists a real need for skilled workers and programs like these. It's something we hear from businesses, both small and large, over and over again, that there just aren't the people to meet the needs of the jobs out there, and the vocational technical schools play a major role in helping to address that shortage. I also had a chance to visit UMass Lowell's iHub Innovation Center. It was a remarkable place. It's a co-working space that allows early-stage entrepreneurs to test their products and concepts. As well, the iHub works to help entrepreneurs connect with resources to get their products and ideas off the ground. So a great facility right in the heart of Lowell that's in partnership with UMass Lowell, but where also the city of Lowell actually plays a role as well. And then on Tuesday of the same last week, I was in Shirley at Phoenix Park, touring a series of small businesses, from a granola company to a high-tech business that produces scientific products, to a gluten-free bakery, to a reimagined printing shop. And on Thursday, I visited Shaker Furniture in Gardner, where the owners gave me a fascinating tour of their long-established local business, which it is a business which prioritizes employee benefits and flexibility. Again, as a reminder, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. I've long been coming from the district that I do, and given that the Merrimack Valley is so rooted in the Industrial Revolution and the home of so many extraordinary manufacturing companies, in its heyday, I've long been a supporter of a Make It in America agenda. It's one way we can boost our economy and support good-paying manufacturing jobs. And to make America once again a magnet for jobs, we do have to invest in manufacturing, innovation, and infrastructure while cutting red tape to help businesses grow. In my role on the House Armed Services Committee, I've pushed for our military to invest in American manufacturing and stick to a long-established law called the Berry Amendment, because I do believe taxpayer dollars should, wherever possible, go towards supporting American-made goods and American jobs. Congress passed the Berry Amendment in 1941 to make sure that American soldiers were trained and operated to the greatest extent possible with American-made uniforms and equipment, especially important as we were entering World War II, but still an ongoing, I think, value that I hold dear. And until recently, though, athletic footwear lacked an American company that could manufacture a 100% American-made shoe. Because of this, the Armed Services circumvented the Berry Amendment by offering cash allowances to enlisted recruits for them to get their running shoes. But today, the domestic shoe industry has rebounded, employing thousands of American workers throughout the country, and this is especially true in Massachusetts. So in 2014, the Defense Department recognized the resurgence of American footwear manufacturing and agreed to change its policy. 2 years later, it had yet to do so. So working with Representative Bruce Poliquin, a Republican from Maine, we introduced legislation this year that requires the Department of Defense to complete that policy change, to adhere to the Berry Amendment, and to offer up American-made shoes to our new recruits. I introduced this legislation as an amendment when the House Armed Services Committee considered its annual bill last week, and this amendment was adopted, meaning that this legislation will be added to the larger National Defense Authorization Act. This is a bill that is typically passed by Congress every year. The Armed Services Committee is one committee that has is truly bipartisan, and every year passes a bill out of the committee that comes to the floor. The Senate, and that is passed out of the House. The Senate similarly does the same thing, and we come to agreement by the end of the year and can make the appropriate investments, especially in the training and equipping of our soldiers. Again, as a reminder, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. Many of the issues facing our country, though, are both international and local in scope. You probably didn't know that Massachusetts exports almost $2 billion worth of commodities to Japan, and that was in 2014, making Japan the fifth largest importer of Massachusetts-made goods and services. And this past February, I was able to get a first-hand look at that relationship between Japan and the United States and Massachusetts, in particular, during a congressional trip to Okinawa and Tokyo. Our bipartisan delegation of members of Congress met with numerous Japanese officials, including the Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, members of Japan's legislative body, the Diet. We met also with U.S. and Japanese military and diplomatic officials, journalists, students. We had a town hall, and as well as business leaders in major Japanese corporations. So this trip really gave me an opportunity to talk with them about potential future economic opportunities for Massachusetts and the 3rd District that happens to also be home to a good number of Japanese-owned companies. Again, remember to ask me a question or give your input at any point. Just press *3 on your phone. Just also wanted to fill you in a bit on my role on the Natural Resources Committee. I was named the highest-ranking Democratic member of the Subcommittee on Federal Lands, which is the subcommittee responsible for all issues related to the National Park System, our U.S. forests, public lands, and national monuments. And there I've been working to make sure that our parks have the resources, especially in their centennial year, to make sure they have the resources they need to continue their mission of preservation, conservation, and education. But we also have an oversight responsibility, and you may have heard that recently the U.S. Department of the Interior's Inspector General, who's tasked with periodic reports on the various governmental agencies, released a report describing evidence of a long-standing pattern of sexual harassment, misconduct, and a hostile work environment at the National Park Service's Grand Canyon River District in Arizona. Being so familiar with this issue in the context of our military, I felt this was something we needed to pursue, and working with Congressman Ruben Gallego from Arizona and Paul Gosar, we wrote a letter to the director of the National Park Service urging them to increase their scope and conduct an agency-wide survey of all Park Service employees to better understand the magnitude of the issue. And Director Jarvis wrote back that they were talking to the Defense Department to learn best how to conduct such a survey, and it's my hope we'll get a complete understanding of just the scope, the breadth of this problem. Again, to ask me a question or give your input at any point, just press *3 on your telephone. These are just a few of the issues facing our country and ways in which I've worked to address them. As the 114th Congress continues on through this year, your feedback is so important for helping me focus on the priorities that matter most to you. And again, this telephone town hall is for me to hear from you directly and let me know what's on your mind. So I'm eager to hear your input. And with that, I'd like to turn it over now to your questions. Again, though, if you're listening and would like to ask a question, please press *3 on your telephone now.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Congresswoman. And we are going to start off our questions here with Ryan in Maynard. And again, anyone that wants to ask a question, please press *3. But Ryan in Maynard, you are live with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Ryan?
Hi, Ryan.
Hi, my name is actually Brian.
Oh, Brian.
I'm sorry.
Our apologies.
Thank you very much, Nikki. If I may, I've been out of politics for a while, suffered some family situation related to colon cancer as well as heroin addiction, and not myself, but my daughter, and that's what prompts my question. But before I get to that, I appreciate your articulation of the number of issues that face not only Massachusetts but the country. It's very, very sophisticated. With regards to my question, what can the public sector do to help combat effectively this addiction with heroin?
Well, it's a good question, and I know it's such a tough issue and so personal for so many, as you yourself have said. I mean, that makes it more real.
Not only statewide, but nationally.
That's right. And so I think we're all struggling with what the best way forward is. I think we saw the Massachusetts legislature take a good step forward with a piece of legislation that begins to look at some of the elements of it. We in Congress actually this week are considering legislation that continues that process, whether it's looking at the prescribing practices of physicians, whether it's looking at the need for better follow-on mental health care, whether it's looking at the effectiveness of all the preventative things we do. But I do think the bottom line at the federal level is going to come down to funding, because all these great ideas don't have much opportunity to take hold if dollars don't follow it. And so I'm strongly supportive of President Obama's proposal of $1.2 billion to make its way out into the states to either support state-initiated programs or some of the programs that the federal government is beginning to propose. So we've seen, for example, Congresswoman Clark from Massachusetts has co-sponsored some legislation that would help hospitals diagnose and treat newborns suffering from opioid exposure. It passed the House. The Senate version passed the House as well, and it was signed into law by the president. But we're all just carving out little pieces of it. I introduced legislation with Congressman Mike Turner that would free up some already existent funding within the federal budget that hasn't been eligible to be used to help with prevention programs for incarcerated individuals. So these are just modest little efforts. But I think what you've seen is government at all levels really taking a hard look more comprehensively at what's needed. And I think we take, more than anything, we're learning from people who've really had to either wrestle with it personally or see it in their own families' lives, as you have. I've had a number of families come and talk to me very painfully, tell their stories of lost family members as a result of this. And I think as hard as it is, as much courage as it takes, I have to thank you for it, because I think more than anything else, it's pushing us in government to really recognize that this is something we have to address. So as I said, this week there will be a whole host of pieces of legislation. I actually also wrote a letter to the FDA once the FDA released its decision to approve OxyContin for use by children as young as 11 years old. The process by which that they undertook the study, it was a pharmaceutical company that stood to benefit from increased prescription habit practices. I just really felt, given all that we were learning about the opioid addiction, that it drew in. There were a lot of questions around that process. And I think what you've also seen is a more bipartisan recognition that this is the case, which is important and very important if we're going to make progress.
All right. Thank you very much for that question. Again, if you have a question for the Congresswoman, please press *3 on your phone at any time. We're going to go to our next question now. It's Helen in Stowe. Helen, you're on the phone with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Congressman, for all your work with everything you've been doing, Congresswoman. Sorry about that. I wanted to ask about any progress that could be made in lifting the embargo to Cuba. It's an entrepreneurial opportunity. The Cuban government is working well with their people to encourage entrepreneurial stuff, and other countries are certainly moving in, and this could be a great opportunity if that could be lifted.
Well, I agree with you, and I am very supportive of the steps that our president has been taking. And so I think we've seen that decades of our isolation of Cuba hasn't accomplished the objective we thought, which was, to help Cubans move to a more open and democratic society. And I think at times our policy also isolated us from the kind of partnerships you're talking about, and in the end limited our ability to influence outcomes not only in Cuba but in the Western Hemisphere. So I'm fully supportive of this. I was glad to see that in the President's recent trip to Cuba, he was joined by several of our Massachusetts members of Congress, Congressman McGovern and Moulton. I know Congressman McGovern has taken a long-standing interest in pushing us to recognize Cuba and to interact more with it. We're moving slowly, and perhaps we'd like to see it move more quickly on a whole host of fronts. But I'm strongly supportive of what the President is doing to open up our relationships with Cuba.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that question. And again, if you have a question, press *3 on your telephone. And our next question is going to be from Linda in Concord. Linda, you're on the phone with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tsongas.
Good evening.
My question is about relates to what you spoke of earlier about bringing more business to the United States, making more products here in the United States, made in America. And I'm wondering what you can do to make corporations spend some of the money that they have been keeping for themselves and not really investing in anything. And is there anything that anyone is doing to encourage them, and more so, to invest in the United States so we can finally buy things that are made here and not go to a store and not be able to find the only things we find are things made in China or in the Far East, and it's very difficult to buy anything that's from the United States.
Well, that's true. I think, especially on the products that are the American consumer tends to need. I haven't been to the dollar store too often, but when I did go, I said this store is like an homage to China, because virtually everything that is there, is not made in this country. But the other thing is that while many of those products that the consumer might need, and we value that we're able to have access to them at a lower cost, there are also many more complex products that are made in the United States. So there is this misperception that we're no longer a manufacturing leader, but the reality is the United States is responsible for 20% of global manufacturing output, whereas China is responsible for 19.8% of manufacturing output. And so that's a number I think is somewhat confounding, because it's not what we hear. And so part of what drives, I think, this misperception is that for too long, multinational corporations, those are corporations that have are located in a number of countries, have sort of fueled the idea that we don't need to make things in this country anymore, that we can invent things here but let our global competitors make them overseas. But in many instances, that idea really ignores the real dangers to our economy, and that is what we continue to struggle with. As I make the rounds in my district, and I referenced a number of businesses that I visited last week, I'm hearing an interesting story, and that is that more manufacturers, those that might have gone to other countries, are coming back. And they're coming back for a number of reasons. One is that I think they're getting tired of the travel. They just don't like that. That's sort of a more personal reason. But the second is that it takes too long to problem solve. If there's a problem that's too far away. The other reality is it takes too long for the product to make its way back here, so that impacts their cash flow. And then finally, often they have a better, even though we don't have enough workers trained to the jobs we need, when they're a very well-trained workforce, and that has great value. And so I think we're starting to see a resurgence in American manufacturing, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need our support, which it does, which is why I was so happy to support New Balance's effort to produce an all-American made shoe. And when I say all-American made shoe, I mean everything, down to the shoelaces or to whatever it may be. Every element has to be all-American made, and that supports small suppliers as well as the larger goals of New Balance as manufacturer of athletic shoe wear. So we have to look for ways to be supportive in our districts. But then again, I think through the policies that we enact, and one of those is as we look at tax reform, to not encourage the offshoring of manufacturing. Even though it's coming back, we want it to happen more quickly. And the other thing is we do have to invest in how we educate our young people. I mean, two things have happened. One is with all the thought that there is no longer manufacturing in America, a lot of young people don't think there are even opportunities there, and that's not the case. But second of all, these manufacturing companies are crying out for trained workers. And that is where our vocational technical schools, which need significant investment, and which is great to see our governor recognize, but also our community colleges are training a lot of that workforce. And then through our continued investment in research and development so that we continue to innovate and make the products of the future. So it's a complex process. Some things may never come back, the less expensive items that we all need in our daily life, but where America really has an opportunity is in the higher end at what we call advanced manufacturing, and that's something we have to all support aggressively.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you, Linda, for your question. Now we are actually going to do a poll question, and Congresswoman, would you like to read that?
Yes, in the course of this town hall, we're going to do a number of poll questions, and this just so I can get your feedback from everybody who's on the line, and this will be our first one. So our country and Massachusetts in particular have seen a disturbing rise in opiate addiction and death, and that we have had one question already on this issue. Have you been personally affected by the opiate crisis? Press 1 for yes and press 2 for no. So press 1 for yes and 2 for no.
Thank you. And again, if you have a question, you can press *3 on your phone at any time this evening during the call to ask Congresswoman Tsongas a question. And as we're taking in those poll results, we're going to jump right to our next question, and that is Thompson in Stowe. Thompson, you are on the phone now with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Excellent, thank you. And first of all, I'd like to commend Congresswoman Tsongas for her desire to, quote, invest in manufacturing and infrastructure, unquote. And my question relates to that.
And how are you? Let me say hi.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good, good. So go ahead with your question.
So there's a road that I think kind of highlights the problem with infrastructure in this country, and that's Route 62 leading from Stowe to Hudson. And as you may know, there's a bridge that was condemned on that road. And we've been told here in Stowe that it's going to take 3 years to design a new bridge and 5 years to build a new bridge, with a total of 8 years to get a new bridge. So I would like to know what you propose to do or what you're doing already to help out with the failing state of infrastructure in this country.
Well, it's a good question, and Stowe is not alone. I don't think any of us can travel around the Commonwealth or our own communities without seeing the real need for investment in infrastructure. Fortunately, this past December, I should say, we did support bipartisan legislation that out of the House that the Senate also supported and President Obama signed into law, which represents a 5-year investment in infrastructure. So it amounts to about $305 billion over a 5-year period, and which would provide the states with more stable and predictable funding for infrastructure investment. So, and this would allow the states to set priorities in addressing the bridges you talked about, the bridge you talked about, the roads you talked about, and improving public transit. Under this bill, Massachusetts will receive over $5 billion of the $305 billion in funding for those projects, which is about 9% higher than the current funding levels that it is receiving. So this money will come to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts will then, at the state level, make decisions as to how to disperse these funds. The other thing that we in Congress did, and what I was happy to do, was to support something called the Tiger Grant. And this was something that came out of the stimulus package. It's called the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery Grant Program, was created by Congress in 2009 and awards the most promising local infrastructure proposals with funds that are needed. So the local community has to apply for these funds, and sometimes that is a way forward. It's highly competitive, but it's a specific pot of funds that can be used for some of these more local investments. So there's two ways forward, but so one directly going to the federal government for funding, but other funding that goes into the state that is then dispersed out to the state to begin to address the many years of not making the investments we need to make. So thank you for your question. It's so important, and we also have to remember how many jobs it creates in the course of making those investments. So thank you, Thompson.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. And again, press *3 if you'd like to ask a question anytime during tonight's telephone town hall. We're going to go right to our next question, and that's Ray in Littleton. Ray, you're on the phone with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Okay,
evening,
thank
Ray.
you. Nice to talk to you, Congresswoman Tsongas. That's Roy, not Ray, but
Roy.
That's all right.
Okay. We're batting 50% tonight. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm an independent, and I probably will be voting for Trump. And I don't want to get on the political end of it per se, but my question is, if Mr. Trump gets in, and I'm confused as to what's going on in the country, and disappointed with a lot of the disruptions and stuff that between the two parties, which I would like to see be able to get together and get something a little more accomplished instead of arguing and bickering and discord. I know it's things are political and that's the way it is, but what would you feel would be the opportunities that you would have and your fellow congresspeople to work with Mr. Trump if he gets in, and try to improve a lot of the situations that are going on in this country at this time, which are numerous. And I was just wondering how you feel about working. I know it's the other party if he wins, but would you be able to work with him and get something done that will help all citizens of the country?
Well, it's a good question, and you're not alone in your concerns. And I think so much of what we're seeing in this election is reflective of those concerns. And as people watch us in Washington, and it's not a simple process that any of us are here part of. We are a very diverse country, and we represent. If I've learned nothing, I've learned just how we're shaped by the places we come from, and how diverse those places are, and all of that comes together in the House of Representatives with 435 of us, doing our best to represent the people who sent us here. And I think, as I said, I think this presidential election is very reflective of that. As I've been in Washington, from the outset, I arrived when President Bush was in his final year. President Obama was then elected, and at that point we had 4 years in which we had the presidency and both houses of Congress, and then, as we know, we lost the House of Representatives, then we lost the Senate, although President Obama, a Democrat, has been there throughout those 8 years. And when I came in the majority in the House, but with a Republican president, I reached across the aisle. When we had all the institutions of government, I reached across the aisle. And what I found is, as we made our way into the minority, because of that reaching across the aisle, I had those on the other side reaching out to me because we were successful. Part of that is due to the House Armed Services Committee, which has this great tradition of bipartisanship. It doesn't matter who our president is. We have to make the investments that defend our country and well prepare those who seek to serve in times of war or peace. That's the bottom line obligation we have, and I think it's one that's shared on that committee, and as a result, you will see us we produce one major bill every year that incorporates everything, and we marked that bill up last week, 2 weeks ago. That's the process by which we sort of walk our way through it and offer amendments and make decisions around what it's going to look like going forward. And virtually everybody, all but 2 people, voted for that bill. That is very unusual in most of the committees here. So I don't expect that to change in terms of how I work across the aisle. And regardless of who our president is, I think we have to continue in that vein and try to find ways to get by. We are all mindful of Donald Trump and the extraordinary route he has traveled to now be likely be the nominee, and we'll make our way through this presidential election year. I have a lot of concerns with his ideas as well as some of the statements he's made. So I am a Hillary Clinton supporter. I do think in these complicated times, she's probably the most experienced candidate we've had in many a year, and that breadth of experience is very valuable and will be very valuable. But whoever is successful, we have to find a way to move this country forward, and I know that I will certainly try to do that.
All right. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Congresswoman. Again, press *3 if you have a question. And right now, I believe we have another poll question. Congresswoman?
Yes, this is poll question 3. What issue do you feel Congress should prioritize the most in the coming months? Press 1 for job creation and the economy. Press 2 for public health challenges like the Zika virus or the opioid crisis. Press 3 for addressing climate change. Press 4 for responding to concerning international situations like those in Syria and Iraq, or press 5 for others. So 1 for job creation and the economy, 2 for public health challenges like the Zika virus, 3 for addressing climate change, 4 for international situations like those in Syria and Iraq, and press 5 for other.
Excellent. Thank you, Congresswoman. We have our next question now. And again, press *3 if you have a question you'd like to ask. We're going to go to Justin in Concord. Justin, you're on the line with Congresswoman Tsongas.
Thank you for taking my question, Congresswoman.
Good evening, Justin.
It's also a political question. I was just wondering how you found things going under Speaker Paul Ryan, whether anything had changed, how things were going under his leadership, and also if we do have, I'm a Democrat, if we have Democratic gains in the fall, a Clinton presidency, perhaps a Democratic Senate, and maybe gaining a dozen seats in the House, do you think that will affect Republican obstructionism going forward?
Well, those are good questions, and I think Paul Ryan is continuing to navigate his way. I think we all can see really in the quandary that our colleagues across the aisle are having in the presidential nominating process. That plays itself out here in the House of Representatives, and so Speaker Ryan, has to navigate a divided party on his own side, among his Republican colleagues. The reality of this institution is that the party of the majority controls everything. So it controls the flow of legislation, what laws are going to be heard by committees, what the amendment process will be in those committees, what the bills will look like as they're reported out of committee, and then they make the decisions whether or not bills that actually come out of the committee are going to come to the floor for a vote, what the debate will look like, and then given their numbers, often what the bill will look like going out as it makes its way out of Congress. So, for example, on the budget, Speaker Ryan has not been able to get agreement among his colleagues, so that while they all agreed that they should not even consider the president's budget, which is quite unusual, quite a breach of protocol that the president's budget didn't even have a hearing before the budget committee, they also can't agree on their own budget. And I think that reflects Speaker Ryan's challenge that he has in his own party. Invariably, as legislation makes its way through the House or through the Senate to be signed by a Democratic president, it has to be have Democratic support. And Speaker Boehner was willing, reluctantly, to finally bring legislation to the floor when push came to shove. Often those laws, in order to pass out of the House and the Senate and be signed by our president, took at least as many Democratic votes as Republican votes in order to become law. And that is still the reality that Speaker Ryan has to contend with, given that we have a Democratic president. So if we have Democratic gains, I think, first of all, given the general unity on the Democratic side of the aisle, that's in general unity, not always, it will be easier to move legislation if we also retain the White House. But once you lose the White House, then if you should lose the White House, and I'll work very hard to make sure that we don't, it becomes a much more challenging process. But the reality is the stronger the majority and the more the majority is in agreement, the easier it is. And Speaker Ryan has had to contend with the majority that has a tough time agreeing among itself.
Excellent. Thank you, Congresswoman. And thank you for that question, Justin. And we're going to move right along to Matt in Stowe. Matt, you're on the line with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call.
Hi, Matt.
Hi. My question relates to the Clean Air and Water Act and a carve-out that was given to the oil and gas industry in 2005, whereby hydrofracking chemicals were removed from the Clean Water and Air Act. I was wondering if you would sponsor or co-sponsor legislation to return oil and gas activities to the restrictions of the Clean Air and Water Act.
Well, that's a good question, and I think there has been legislation introduced that would do just that, that I have been supportive of. So I'd have to look at the particulars, but I think there has been legislation introduced that recognizes that should not have taken place, and that would seek to change that, and I would certainly look at it. I have to say the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act are things, and the National Environmental Protection Act, these are all things that we debate regularly on the Natural Resources Committee, on where I am the chair, the ranking member. That means lead Democrat of the Subcommittee on Federal Lands, and where there are ongoing efforts often to shortchange or sidestep these important bedrock environmental laws that I always feel very important to defend the important role they play in protecting our landscape, protecting our air, protecting our water, and it's an ongoing effort because there are many who seek to undermine them, but it's something we really have to stay on top of. So thank you for that question, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that question. Again, *3 if you want to ask a question this evening. We're going to move right along to Monica in Carlisle. Monica, you're live with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Hi, Congressman Tsongas. Thanks for taking my question. I'm a mother of 3, and I'm a little bit concerned about the current transgender laws, and I'm curious about your thoughts and if any broad solutions or ideas might be under consideration. As I know, this is a sensitive issue, but to me, both sides have valid concerns, and current understanding out there is very wide open to interpretation, and I have some concerns, and I'm curious as to your stance on this.
Well, I along with Congressman Kennedy and others, wrote a letter in support of the transgender laws that Massachusetts has been debating, and I gather there's been an effort to address some of the concerns of untoward behavior that I think you're concerned with, and that as a result of that, the legislation is likely to move forward. In general, I've been a strong supporter of all the efforts around equality for the LGBT community. My husband was a United States Senator, and back in 1979, introduced the first employment protections for sexual orientation. So these are issues that have been long part of our my family's philosophy of equality, and things that we've worked hard to move ahead. And I think we've seen extraordinary change in a very short period of time. But these are important debates, and I think it's important that concerns are addressed, that as they're raised, they're taken seriously and addressed. And I do think that those concerns are being addressed in the legislation that's moving forward in the Massachusetts legislature. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Monica, for that question. And again, another reminder to just press *3 if you'd like to ask a question this evening to Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas. And we're going to move on to our next question, and that is from Kitty in Carlisle. Kitty, you're on the phone with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Hi, Nikki. This is Kitty, And
Hi, Kitty.
My question is, first of all, how are you? And thank you for doing such a good job. And number two, what can we do about the Supreme Court and Congress?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a question shared by many. So I think you and I would agree anyway that obstructing the nomination isn't good for our country, and it has put many important decisions on hold. We've already seen evidence of some of the split decisions that have followed because of the failure to move ahead. And so I do think the Senate should fulfill its duty to the Supreme Court, to this as an institution, as well as to our country. There's ample precedent for the Senate to act on a Supreme Court nominee during an election year. If they don't, it's likely to leave the Supreme Court with a vacancy for 2 terms, which is unprecedented and a disservice to this country. I think as a result, if they don't do it through now, and then if the new president coming in, it takes that much longer, as these hearings are not simple. And it's, unfortunately, another example of my Republican colleagues, unwillingness to sort of reinforcing the partisan atmosphere in Washington. So it's it's more than unfortunate. But there may yet be an opportunity in the lame duck session. I think the colleagues across the aisle are sort of looking to see what the outcome of the election. I happen to see a United States senator who happened to be a Republican say that depending on who wins, that especially he felt if there was likely to be a more liberal nominee than Mr. Garland, that he thought there would be movement in the lame duck session. So I certainly think Merrick Garland is a very qualified candidate, and he deserves to go through the hearing process. So thank you for that question.
All right. Thank you, Kitty. Thank you for that question. And we're going to move right along to Linda from Boxborough. Linda, you're on the line now with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you for taking the call. My question is about how we can protect seniors against mail and telephone fraud. I know that this is a big issue. My parents in particular were targeted by the Jamaicans, and I tried to get the Jamaican exchange, blocked on my phone, and I was told by their service provider, Comcast, that was impossible. I don't know why, and I don't know what we can do to help protect them. They've got piles and piles of mail as well. And I do know it's been investigated before. It's an issue that's well known, but is there anything that Congress is looking at to try to protect our seniors?
Well, I know I'm not alone, and your parents are not alone. I've heard from many 3rd District residents talking about the frequent and intrusive number of these unsolicited calls, whether they're robocalls or otherwise, that they've been receiving. And there have been efforts to prevent these unwanted calls. There was something called, we created the National Do Not Call Registry in 2004, but the Federal Communications Commission has said it's received about 215,000 complaints about this just last year. So, and the Federal Trade Commission, which runs that registry, says it receives more than 150,000 complaints about these calls every month. So while they're taking steps to prosecute people or groups that violate the Do Not Call list, as you said, many of these calls originate overseas. And that's where the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission do not have jurisdiction. So that's the challenge. We have more jurisdiction in the country, but when they're coming from outside the country, we don't. So the FCC did recently approve rules that would strengthen consumers' right and give phone companies the ability to offer consumers technologies to block these calls, as well as spam text messages. So there are efforts moving forward, and we also continue to look at legislative solutions. So I'm a co-sponsor of a bill, the Anti-Spoofing Act of 2015, which seeks to cut down on robocalls by prohibiting spoofing, which is a practice in which con artists disguise their phone numbers to make it look like they're calling from another numbers. So we're working on this on a variety of fronts, but for those calling from outside the country, the problem there is that we just don't have jurisdiction. But it's something we all hear about and over again, and something where we are working to try to address it. But technology changes so quickly that it just makes it sometimes that much harder to stay on top of. But thank you for your call. And please feel free to call my office, too, if there's something we can do to be more specifically helpful.
Excellent. Thank you for your question, Linda. And Congresswoman, I think we have one last poll question.
Yes, and this really follows on the question about confirming Mr. Garrick. Do you believe the United States Senate should hold confirmation hearings in order to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court? Press 1 for yes or press 2 for no. So do you believe that they should hold confirmation hearings in order to fill the vacancy for Mr. Garland? Press 1 for yes, press 2 for no.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Congresswoman. And just one last reminder, press star 3 on your phone if you'd like to ask a question. And we're going to go with our next question is caller Mike from Carlisle. Mike, you are live with Congresswoman Nikki Tsongas.
Yes, thank you, Nikki.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm really concerned with with a couple of overarching issues. And one of them is the statement we seem to get that population and economic growth will solve our problems. And yet the United States has a population that's generally considered at least double that of honest sustainability. And as a result of that, we're not only dealing with global warming, but traffic and lack of water and air pollution, and pushing everything else off the planet other than humans, and frankenfoods to feed the growing population. And I want to know, what it would take for Congress to consider honest sustainability, and to do that, to get to a steady state economy, to decide it's time to get to the point where our population has to stabilize.
Well, it's an interesting question, and the way that I realize it probably more than anything is when my husband was in Congress in 1974, he represented about 425,000 people. So a congressional district, all our congressional districts have to be the same size. There are 435 of them across this country, and he represented about 425,000 people. So I now represent about 725 to 30,000 people. So we still have the same number of districts, but it's almost doubled in population, even though as Massachusetts has grown at a slower rate than the rest of the country, which is why, over time we've lost several seats in Congress. But the reality is that it's dramatically sort of draws attention to the fact that we are a growing country. In terms of how we deal with these issues, it's not a simple thing, and I think it's more just we do wrestle with growth. We certainly have seen that with the downturn, economic growth. We've certainly seen that in the downturn in our economy, the numbers of lost jobs, how we bring our economy back and continue to support the population and support it well that we do have. We wrestle with the structural issues that really do have become so apparent, in which too few people at the top benefit more than everybody else, which is a real issue and something I think we have to contend with and are contending with, and it's a dominant issue in this presidential election, as it should be. So there are a whole host of issues sort of embedded in what you're talking about. Having just come from Japan, where they are struggling with a declining population, dramatically declining population, which has led them to outsource much of their manufacturing, surprisingly, because they don't have a population that, one, can support the workforce, and two, they don't have a population that is sufficient enough to make their companies profitable. So they've located so much of their manufacturing, for example, not in Massachusetts, but in this country and elsewhere where the population is growing. So it's a complicated problem, and one that has to be thought through carefully But it's not one that, other than the way in which we just wrestle with economic growth and jobs and making sure our families can support themselves, it's not one that's front and center in terms of the daily debate here. And yet, I think you raise an important issue and something that we are going to have to think about. So in Massachusetts, for example, we struggle sometimes with the fact that we're growing, but we grow at a lesser rate, and what that might mean economically, even if it might make us more sustainable. So they're complicated issues and things that we have to think about, and I thank you for your question. With that, I want to thank everyone for participating in our telephone town hall tonight. We've had some great questions. This discussion was really useful to me, as it always is, and I need to hear directly from you about the things that you care about. If I didn't have a chance to get to your question this evening, there will be an opportunity to leave me a voicemail in just a minute, and we'd be happy to get back to you on your question. So it's very important, though, that if you want to get a response to your question, that you leave your name, your address, your phone number, and email address. You can also visit my website at www.tsongas.house.gov or follow me on Facebook and Twitter to learn more about what I've been working on, or to email me any thoughts or questions. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/repsongas and on Twitter at Nikki in the House. So thanks again for all of you for choosing to participate in tonight's telephone town hall meeting, and have a great evening. Thank you and good night.